Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are strapping in for a pretty intense look at the revival of urban whiskey distillation. We're focusing specifically on the Glasgow 1770 distillery. Our mission, as always, is to take this pile to source material. We've got a really detailed whiskey review, some great background from the Danish retailer Whisky.dk, and, pull out what really matters.
And it's a fascinating story, isn't it? It's really about modern whiskey economics. How does a relatively young brand, founded less than, 15 years ago? How does it even survive in the world of Scotch? A world just dominated by centuries of history and, frankly, huge stocks of aged whiskey.
Absolutely. And this is a brand that literally had to sort of raise itself from the ashes.
Yeah.
The original Glasgow Distillery back in 1770, that closed over 100 years ago, early 1900s. Glasgow just went silent for single malt production.
A massive gap, yeah. And it wasn't until 2012, quite recently, that Liam Hughes and Mark Hayward, a couple of friends, decided to refound the Glasgow Distillery Company. They finally got the place open and running in 2014. That's a huge undertaking, a real act of, historical reclamation.
But you have to wonder, how do you persuade people you're serious? I mean, you're up against distilleries that can put out a 50-year-old whiskey if they want to. It feels like an impossible fight.
It does seem that way, but there's definitely a strategy. The sources point out something quite clever. Their very first product wasn't even whiskey. It was a Makar original dry gin.
Ah, right. That makes sense. Get some cash flow going while the whiskey matures.
Exactly. Quick revenue while the spirit was quietly doing its thing in the warehouses. And that patience eventually led to the 1770 whiskey series we're looking at today.
Okay, so that really sets up the core question for this deep dive, doesn't it? How does a young distillery compete? And maybe more interestingly, what happens when they decide, tradition isn't quite enough? When they start using these really intense, sometimes pretty experimental cask finishes to, accelerate the character of their young spirit. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. And maybe start with the basics, their philosophy. Glasgow's 1770 seems really anchored on two key things for quality. Non-chill filtered and no added color.
Right, and that's not just marketing fluff, is it? That actually affects the whiskey.
Oh, absolutely. It's about keeping those natural oils, the esters, all the things that give whiskey its flavor and, crucially, its mouthfeel, leaving them in the liquid.
And they've really tied themselves to the city itself, beyond just the name. I love that detail about the stills. They've got 4 copper stills, right? And they named them Tara, Meharry, Margaret, and Francis.
Yeah, after the founders' families and some local artists, it's a nice touch. It really roots the brand, gives it that sense of place.
So that kind of intentionality, that storytelling, must be part of selling a younger whiskey.
Definitely. And it extends to their core range. They produce 3 main styles, the original, the peated, and the triple distilled. Shows off their range right from the start.
All right, let's dig into the non-peated ones first, because the production methods are quite different. The triple distilled, that's 46% ABV, and it's explicitly done in the Irish style.
It is. And that choice tells you a lot about the profile they're aiming for. Triple distillation, compared to the usual Scottish double, tends to strip out more of the heavier compounds. You get a cleaner, lighter spirit as a result. And then they age it in virgin oak and ex-bourbon casks.
Virgin oak? That's a pretty aggressive choice for a young distillery, isn't it? Gives flavor fast.
It's almost essential for them, I'd argue. Virgin oak wood that hasn't held anything before just floods the spirit with flavor quickly. You get that vanilla, that spice, that structure that often takes much longer in refill casks. The reviewer described the triple distilled as fresh, fruity, lots of vanilla with a little pepper at the end. Sounds like a really good entry point. A daily dram, maybe?
Yeah, sounds very approachable. Then you've got the original. The reviewer calls it the Big Brother. Also 46%, same cask mix, virgin oak and bourbon, but this one's double distilled. Standard Scottish style.
Right. And that difference in distillation is key. Double distilling leaves more of those heavier oils and esters behind, and that translates directly to how it feels in your mouth. Where the triple distilled is light, the original is described as much more oily, creamier. Holds the flavor longer.
And the flavor itself is bigger, more punch.
Yeah, punchier is a good word. A stronger, spicier, almost peppery kick compared to the triple distilled. It really shows off the base spirit from Glasgow, what it can do with standard Scottish methods.
Okay, but here's the crunch, the commercial challenge the sources bring up. The original sounds like a good dram, but it's in a price range where it's competing against established names. And many of those competitors do have age statements on the bottle, 10 years, 12 years.
That's the hurdle. They're relying on the quality of production, the NCF, the story, to justify a price point that others justify with, time and cask.
So is being non-chill filtered and having natural color enough to win against a number on the label for the average buyer?
For the enthusiast, maybe?
Hmm.
Those things matter a lot to whiskey geeks. Transparency, NCF status, big pluses. But for someone just browsing the shelf, that missing age statement can be a barrier. It forces them to differentiate in other ways, which leads us to either heavy peat or those more extreme cask finishes.
Right. Let's move on to the smoky side then. This is where the reviewer admitted things hit their sweet spot. Peat and power.
Yeah, their standard peated expression.
Yeah.
It's not messing around. They're using peat at 50 ppm, parts per million.
50 ppm. Okay, for context, where does that sit? Islay level.
Oh yeah, that's comfortably in the heavy hitter category. Think Ardbeg, Laphroaig territory. Serious smoke.
Wow. Okay, so what does that actually taste like in a younger whiskey? Is it just pure smoke?
Well, it's definitely a core flavor.
Yeah.
Intense campfire, maybe some earthy notes, that sort of thing. But the key, especially with young, heavily peated spirit, is how you balance it. And they do that with the finishing cask. It's initially laid down in virgin oak, then finished in a PX cask, Pedro Ximénez sherry.
Ah, PX, the sherry bomb cask. Super sweet, loads of raisin, date flavors.
Exactly that. So you take this intense, smoky spirit, the review mentions BBQ smoke, leather, campfire notes, and you slam it together with that massive syrupy PX sweetness. It's that classic sweet pea combination, balanced through contrast. The result sounds pretty complex, BBQ, leather, but with this balancing fruitiness.
Sounds good, but the reviewer seemed even more keen on the cask strength version. The peated cask strength, hitting 60.7% ABV. Why the preference for that extra kick?
This is really important for understanding flavor. When you dilute whiskey, say from 60.7% down to 46%, you inevitably lose some things. Some volatile compounds, some fatty esters that add texture and complexity just drop out. At 60.7%, everything's still in there. You get a much fuller mouthfeel, more intensity.
So the high alcohol isn't just about heat, it's about keeping the flavors intact. Integration.
Precisely. That power seems to amplify everything. The reviewer found notes of dark chocolate, black coffee, brown sugar, really deep flavors. And interestingly, the smoke, while still massive, was described as totally subdued, integrated, thanks to that powerful PX cask and the high ABV. Magnificent was a word used, I think, like fresh coffee roasted over campfire. That's where Glasgow 1770 starts sounding like it can really play with the big boys.
Okay, so that's a clear success story for using a powerful cask finish. Now let's pivot to their more experimental side. The small batch series. This is where they really start playing with unusual casks, port, sauternes, different sherry types, creating limited innovative stuff, taking risks.
And what's really interesting here is how polarizing that innovation can be. These intense finishes can create wildly different reactions. Love it or hate it territory. The sources gave us two perfect examples, almost polar opposites on the reaction scale.
Okay, example number 1, the Tokaji finish, bottled at 52% ABV. Let's start with the wine Tokaji. Not everyone might know it.
Right. Tokaji is a very famous sweet dessert wine, primarily from Hungary, though also Slovakia. And a special character comes from something called noble rot. Sounds bad, but it's actually a beneficial fungus. It shrivels the grapes, concentrates the sugars and acids, results in this incredibly intense, complex sweetness.
Noble rot. Okay, so they take a cask that held this super concentrated sweet wine and they put their triple distilled spirit in it. Sounds intense.
It's definitely a bold move. But it seems to have worked really well with that lighter, cleaner, triple distilled spirit. It didn't clash. The flavor profile was apparently all about that complex sweetness. Apricots came through strongly, lots of layers. Now, the reviewer did mention an initial raw note on the nose, which can happen with younger spirits, but they felt the 52% ABV helped push past that. This specific bottling was highly recommended, a real success.
So Tokaji finish a win for innovation. Now for the contrast you mentioned, the Ruby port cask.
Yeah.
55% ABV.
Yes, this is where personal taste just smacks you in the face. The reviewer, very candidly, admits a strong personal dislike for port cask finish whiskey in general.
How strong are we talking? Just not their cup of tea or...
Oh, much stronger than that.
Yeah.
Quite visceral, really. They describe the tannins, that slightly drying, astringent quality you get from red wine casks, as creating a cloying aftertaste.
Yeah.
And the comparison used was semi-stale box wine.
Ouch. That's a pretty brutal takedown.
It really is. But what makes this source material so useful is it also includes the distillery's perspective. Libby Barmby, their marketing executive, describes that exact same whiskey as having notes of berries and toffee.
Berries and toffee versus stale box wine. Wow.
Exactly. And that contrast just perfectly highlights the point. A powerful cask finish, like port, doesn't just add flavor. It can fundamentally change the whiskey's entire character, Port casks, especially ruby port, often bring heavy tannins, sweetness, loads of color. If you happen to dislike that specific profile, it doesn't matter how good the underlying spirit is, the cask dominates.
It really brings it back to the listener, doesn't it? We've all had that experience. You try something super peaty, intensely sherried, maybe port finished, and it just doesn't click for you personally. It shows how the cask can become the main event.
Absolutely. The finish becomes the gatekeeper, the arbiter of whether you'll enjoy it. For a young distillery like Glasgow 1770, these small batch experiments are crucial. It's how they show off their skill, create excitement, and build a reputation for flavor creation while they wait for that age statement to become less of an issue.
So pulling it all together, what's the big picture for Glasgow 1770? It seems like they're doing a smart balancing act, honoring tradition, that 1770 name, the transparency, but pairing it with really aggressive innovation, especially with those standouts like the Takagi finish and that peated cask strength.
Yeah, the overall impression is that the brand is solid, the quality is definitely there, but the key takeaway from the review seems to be that the most exciting, the most highly praised expressions are the ones where they really push the boundaries with cask finishing. They're making the biggest impact not necessarily in the standard 10 or 12-year-old market yet, but in that high-intensity, small-batch flavor space.
And the exciting thing about a young distillery is, well, the future's always getting closer.
It is. The sources make that point explicitly. The distillery is young, but they clearly have good spirit maturing. The reviewer is specifically looking forward to seeing genuinely aged expressions start to emerge. Whiskey that can stand on its own merits of maturation without needing such dominant cask finishes. They actually mentioned keeping an eye out around 2028. That could be when we see their aged stock really start to shine.
Okay, 2028. Put a note in the calendar. Which leaves us with the final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given that these young, modern distilleries like 1770 often rely heavily on intense finishes, PX, Tokaji, port, to quickly build complex, mature tasting profiles, does this kind of innovation represent the true future of Scotch, giving us complex flavors now? Or is it more of a necessary, maybe temporary shortcut while we all wait for their base spirit to gain genuine age and maturity in the cask?
It's that core dilemma of innovation versus time, isn't it? They need these techniques to compete today. Whether those techniques remain their defining feature in 10 or 15 years when age isn't the constraint it is now. Well, that's the really fascinating question to watch. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Glasgow's whiskey revival.